Transfer box reassembly. Apologies in advance. This is going to be a bit stop-start, and I'll do my best to keep my hands out of the way, arms, whatever, legs, they're fine. Before you start putting it back together, you need to measure the end float. So the thrust washer needs to go back on, and that circlip. I've already done that, so this is okay. So once you put the circlip and the washer in the circlip in that order, you need to measure the float that is between the gears there. The pictures are in the book. If that's outside your tolerances, then you need to get a new thrust washer a little bit thicker. Then rear inner bearing needs to go on, greased up. Then you can put it into the box. I'll do that and then pick it up. Okay, after you've fitted, or after you've done your measurements on the thrust bearing, fit the front, or the rear bearing, sorry, I keep thinking it's the front because it's that way around. Fit the rear output bearing. That just needs driving on. It's not an overly tight fit, but you will need a drift on that. I used a piece of scaffolding bolt, fits beautifully. Trying to keep my arms out of the way. Shaft goes in, wiggle to engage the gears. And that be that. Now, next stage is to get the thrust washer on in this position, circlip behind it, then the front, which is correct this time, output bearing, then followed by the outer of the front output bearing and the circlip to retain it. Back soon. Front bearing and circlip fitted. Now I normally like to pull bearings into position with a bolt and some spacers and what have you, and pull it in, but there is no alternative on this apart from tapping it in gently with something gentle. So once that's in position, flip it, then front bearing gets, rear bearing, I keep calling that front, rear bearing gets tapped into position until you take up all of the end float and the shaft still rotates. I will begin tapping shortly. That's the outer, then tapped in. You will get a small protrusion here. I've got 2mm all round. I suppose the advantage would have been if I'd have measured it before I took it apart. Anyway, end float all taken up. One of the advantages, if you should over tap that in and push the whole lot through, it will help settle this front bearing up against the circlip. And then if your movement's too tight, a sharp tap to the front and it just eases that outer slightly and gives you a nice movement. Right, so that's the output shaft complete. That's about all we can do to the transfer box at the moment until we start putting it back on the gearbox. So I'll put this one together. Whether I post it yet or not, I don't know. Anyway, transfer output shaft done. If you're interested in seeing how the front output shaft engages, then I shall endeavour to show. Excuse me. So this is your four-wheel drive high-low four-wheel drive engager and fork. There's your drive cog and there's the dog that sits together. Highly technical oil thrower, just a piece of metal bolted on, spins it up, splashes it all over. Somebody make an advert about that, didn't they? Anyway, if you can see here, this bottom rod, this is held forward by a pin that stops it from engaging four-wheel drive. To show you, I've had to take the spring off that operates this because it just won't hold together. So when you push the yellow knob down, the spring behind here pushes this piece forward, which then pushes this pivot bar and pulls the outer onto the inner dog. And that's it. That then engages that with the gear. To disengage it, you then push that one back, spring goes back, brings this lever forward, pin drops back in, and you're disengaged again. So that will then spin freely on the shaft. So when the selector comes forward, just engages on that dog. And that's it. It's not highly technical. It's a very simple mechanism. But then again, when these were first designed, everything was very simple. So don't forget, on here, behind this, go spring retainer and spacer. And it's that puts the pressure on this to move that pivot bar either way. Hope that's of help. Following the instructions in the big book of rules. So assemble the shafts into the front output housing, making sure that pin is that pivot pin across the middle is located on both shafts and moves freely. I like to put some molly grease on that just to make sure it moves. You can get the dog on, push them all forward and get the dog on. Once the springs are under tension, that will disengage the four-wheel drive mechanism. Do say put the output flange and oil seals and everything back on together, but at this stage I don't think that's necessary. I've done it before like that. One main thing you've got to do is make sure once you've pushed all them forward, you get the four-wheel drive pin in position, and that will retain mechanism forward for the time being. And then all you have to do, put a new gasket on, slide these into the holes in the transfer box, making sure that you slide the high-low shaft through the fork on the way in and bolt it up. And I am probably going to swear at that point while I'm jiggling all that back together, so I might not necessarily film that, but you get the idea. Put the output housing together, put the four-wheel drive pin in, new gasket, nuts and bolts, job done. One thing you do have to put is in the four-wheel drive and the output high-low shaft, there are O-rings. Just make sure they're replaced when you do the job, otherwise it'll leak. But it's gonna leak anyway, so it's English, made in Britain. Hey. This alloy does become slightly porous and leaks anyway after a time being, so all you can do is the best you can, seal up all the holes. That'll do for now, I think. One thing I forgot to mention, retainer plate for keeps the ends of the shafts clean and holds the O-rings in position. You can put that on at this stage, it'll stop your bits falling apart. Okay, bye for now. Right, transfer box and front output shaft back together. The one thing you need to make sure of, if I can get this in picture properly, there we go, you get that selector on. As you slide this lot back, you need to reach up inside, hold that as you slide the two parts together. The rods slide into the respective holes. The output dog at the front needs to slide into its receptacle and tighten the nut up once you've got the bolt inside the groove. Then, before I go much further and finish tightening up, what I like to do is just make sure that everything works. So, turning the rear output shaft, that runs freely. Drop the four-wheel drive, that then turns the front and locks up nicely. Back to low ratio, still turns together, locks up nicely. Put the rod back in the hole, bring it back to two-wheel drive, and four-wheel drive's disengaged. You can see I've put the front casing cover on. That covers up your output, your movable shafts, and it also holds the oil seal around your high-low shaft and the four-wheel drive pin. Next job will be to put a new gasket and the bearing holder back into position. Not bearing holder, Pratt, bearing's already in. The oil seal. Greased up nicely inside. Dust cover on the outside or shroud. New gasket. Front output on and front output nut retainer. In the book it does say to, I've just dropped it out. Here we go. It does say to put torque the nut up at this point, but that means putting a pair of Stilsons or something on the back of the shaft, and you're going to make a mess of the shaft on that. So personally I like to put it on loose, same with the back one when that goes back together, and then lock the gearbox up like we did when we was taking it apart. Torque up all the shafts, the front, the rear and the lay shaft while it's all locked up, and just make sure it's all working afterwards. That'll do. I'll use some gasket glue now. No names mentioned, but I like the red stuff because when you take it apart again it cleans up nicely. Just personal preference really. Can't think of much more to say on that. That's it now for this part. Oh, not quite. Nearly forgot the detemp plunger. Stop the shaft from bouncing in and out, or dab of grease on the end of that, spring to follow it. Use my grease insertion tool, very useful. Dab of grease, drop that in the hole, spring, followed down by its retainer. You can put the top cover on this piece, but you know, I do the two together. Not a lot of point. You do the two gaskets at the same time then. Right, that'll do.